The Jimi Hendrix you know is a myth built on fire, feedback, and Woodstock. But the real story didn't happen on stage. It happened in the silence of 4 a.m., in the lost hours between shows that blurred into madness. This is the story of the quiet habits that created a legend and eventually destroyed him. Charles R. Cross, in Room Full of Mirrors, frames Hendrix as a man who was constantly surrounded by reflections, public projections, expectations, and versions of himself he didn't always recognize. And that idea matters, because when you look closely at how he lived day to day, you start to see the same pattern, a life shaped less by schedules and more by whatever version of himself he was trying to hold together that night. Jimi Hendrix did not live by the clock the way most people do. Time for him was elastic. Friends, bandmates, and managers often described him as existing slightly out of phase with the normal world, as if his internal tempo never fully synchronized with everything happening around him. He didn't wake up early unless he had to. He didn't go to bed because it was late. Those markers belonged to someone else's life. Cross's biography leans into this disconnect, not as a romantic quirk, but as a genuine way Hendrix moved through the world, like someone whose inner life ran on a different current than the one surrounding him. Sleep came only when exhaustion finally overpowered momentum. Some nights that meant collapsing just before dawn. Other times it meant vanishing for long stretches, his body quietly reclaiming what it had been denied. His internal rhythm answered to creativity, not hours. If his mind was active, he stayed awake. If it went quiet, he rested, no matter what time it was supposed to be. And even that rest wasn't always restful. When your life is built around movement, tours, studios, people demanding your attention, sleep becomes less of a reset button and more like a forced shutdown. As a result, days lost their boundaries. Mornings became optional. Some days began in the afternoon, when the world was already moving. Others began at dusk, when most people were shutting down. And occasionally, a day never really ended at all, stretching from one night into the next without a clear division. A hotel room bleeding into a studio bleeding into a stage. Cross describes a career pace that didn't just accelerate, it swallowed normal life. Once that happens, routine stops meaning breakfast and bedtime. It becomes whatever pattern you repeat while trying to survive the velocity. At first, this freedom felt natural, even necessary. It allowed Hendrix to follow ideas to their fullest expression without interruption. But it also removed the safeguards that forced pause. Without fixed edges, without consistent rest, fatigue didn't announce itself. It accumulated quietly beneath the surface, becoming part of the background rather than a warning. And the dangerous thing about that kind of fatigue is that you can still function inside it for a long time. You can still smile, still perform, still create. You just start paying for it later. Hendrix wasn't rebelling against time. He was slowly losing track of it. And as the days stretched and folded in on themselves, the clock didn't disappear. It just stopped offering mercy. In Room Full of Mirrors, that idea of reflection becomes more than imagery. It becomes a condition. When you're famous that fast, time stops feeling like something you control and starts feeling like something that controls you. When Hendrix woke up, he was usually quiet, not withdrawn or distant, just soft in his movements, as if he needed time to fully arrive in the world. This stood in sharp contrast to the image audiences carried of him as wild or flamboyant. Offstage, there was very little spectacle. He was gentle in conversation, polite to a fault, more likely to listen than to fill silence. He didn't enter rooms with momentum. He seemed to float into them, present but unobtrusive, almost careful not to disturb the space around him. Cross and other accounts emphasize this contrast again and again. The public Hendrix who could dominate a stage, and the private Hendrix who seemed uncomfortable being the center when there wasn't a guitar creating the space for him. Hendrix didn't snap awake and launch into action. He eased into awareness slowly, allowing his thoughts to settle before engaging with anyone else. There was no checklist, no urgency to get started. Productivity wasn't something he chased early in the day. Instead, he let the noise of his own mind calm enough for ideas to surface on their own terms. This is where the mirrors idea quietly fits. Because a mind that's constantly being watched, constantly being interpreted, often learns to retreat inward before it faces the world again. Almost always, within arm's reach, was a guitar. It didn't signal the start of work. It was simply there, like a familiar object that anchored him. He would pick it up absent-mindedly, play a few notes without intention, then set it down again. Sometimes nothing came of it. Other times a fragment emerged, a phrase, a tone, a bend, and the day quietly shifted direction. That's the part people miss. The myth makes it seem like genius arrives fully formed. In reality, it often arrives as a few seconds of sound, almost accidental, that you either catch or you lose. These moments weren't performances. There was no audience, no pressure. Just a man reconnecting with the one thing that consistently made sense to him. Before the demands of the day arrived, the schedules, the expectations, the noise, Hendrix allowed himself this small pocket of stillness. It was a way of grounding himself before stepping back into a world that increasingly moved faster than he did. Cross's portrait of Hendrix suggests that he didn't just crave solitude. He needed it, because it was one of the only places where he wasn't forced to be a symbol. And even here in these quiet beginnings, the pattern was already present. The guitar wasn't something he put away once the day started. It stayed close, pulling him forward, gently at first, then more insistently, until stillness gave way to immersion once again. And the deeper he went into that immersion, the harder it became to resurface and live like a normal person again, which is part of the tragedy hiding inside the routine. Hendrix played constantly, not in structured practice sessions, but in fragments. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. A riff repeated over and over while pacing a room. He would pick up the guitar while talking, while watching television, while waiting for food. Playing wasn't an activity, it was a resting state. Friends recalled that even when he wasn't actively writing songs, his fingers were always searching, adjusting, bending strings, chasing sounds that didn't yet have names. There's a kind of nervous energy in that. Not panic, not chaos, just a mind that won't stop scanning for the next doorway. One of Hendrix's most defining habits was writing wherever he happened to be, without ceremony or preparation. He didn't wait for quiet rooms or the right moment. Inspiration didn't arrive on schedule, so he adapted by always being ready. Notebooks traveled with him. Loose scraps of paper were folded into jacket pockets. Hotel stationery became temporary canvases. If something came to him, it had to be caught immediately, no matter where he was standing. Cross emphasizes that Hendrix's inner life was constantly moving. Thoughts, images, ideas, and writing was one of the few ways he could pin those thoughts down before the next demand pulled him away. His handwriting reflected that urgency. Lyrics were rarely neat. Lines ran into each other. Margins were ignored. Words were stacked, circled, scratched out, rewritten at odd angles, sometimes layered on top of earlier thoughts. These pages weren't meant for anyone else to read. They were working documents, snapshots of ideas in motion. Hendrix wasn't trying to preserve poetry. He was trying to prevent disappearance. In the mirror's sense, the page becomes a kind of private reflection, not the polished image the public sees, but the raw version that only exists for him. Many of these early drafts were incomplete by design. Single lines, fragmented phrases, images without context. Hendrix trusted that meaning would assemble itself later, once the music caught up. Writing for him wasn't about finishing, it was about capturing. Once an idea escaped, he didn't assume it would come back. And when your life is accelerating the way his was, you start learning that the later you keep promising yourself doesn't always arrive. People close to him noticed that this habit intensified during periods of heavy touring and recording. The faster his life moved, the more urgently he wrote. Hotel rooms became temporary headquarters for creativity. Lyrics were pinned to walls, spread across beds, tucked into instrument cases. The act of writing grounded him when everything else felt transient. Cross's biography repeatedly returns to this theme. Hendrix, searching for something stable inside a life that never stayed still. This wasn't romantic journaling, it was survival. Hendrix understood instinctively that inspiration was fragile, that once a thought passed, it might be gone forever. So he wrote the way some people breathe, reflexively, compulsively, without pause. Each line was a small act of preservation, a way of holding on to something fleeting, long enough to turn it into sound. And the irony is that the more the world demanded Hendrix the icon, the more he seemed to rely on these private scraps to remember Hendrix the person. Meals were irregular, almost incidental. Hendrix didn't follow a structured diet, and he didn't treat food as a daily anchor the way most people do. On tour, he ate what was nearby, late-night room service, backstage plates gone cold, whatever someone put in front of him between sound check and stage time. Sometimes that meant eating at 2 in the morning. Other times, it meant not eating at all. Food wasn't something he planned around. It was something that happened if it happened. That's another small way a life loses normal edges. You stop having meals. You have interruptions. What mattered more than hunger was momentum. Hendrix lived in extended creative stretches where normal signals, fatigue, appetite, even time, faded into the background. If he was locked into a sound, a lyric, or a recording session that felt alive, stopping to eat felt intrusive, almost disruptive. Bandmates and engineers recalled long studio nights where Hendrix would play for hours, moving between takes, amplifiers, and effects without pause, only realizing how depleted he was when someone else pointed it out. Cross highlights how the constant pressure around Hendrix didn't just shape his career, it shaped his body, his habits, his basic ability to reset. There are multiple accounts of Hendrix forgetting meals entirely during extended recording sessions, sometimes going an entire day without eating, only becoming aware of it when dizziness or exhaustion set in. Even then, he didn't always stop immediately. Hunger was something to be managed later, not addressed in the moment. Creativity came first. The body followed or tried to. When a mind is living in sound, the body becomes something you drag behind you, until it finally demands attention in a way you can't ignore. This wasn't discipline in the traditional sense. It was immersion. Hendrix didn't neglect food because he didn't care. He neglected it because his attention was elsewhere. Sound eclipsed appetite. Inspiration overrode routine. And over time, that pattern became another quiet habit of a life lived almost entirely in service of the next note. Cross's framing makes this feel less like eccentricity and more like a warning sign hiding in plain sight. The body quietly being asked to survive a pace it was never designed to endure. Afternoons when he wasn't traveling were often spent listening to music. Blues records, soul, jazz. He studied sound the way other musicians studied theory. He didn't just hear notes, he heard texture, space, emotion. Hendrix would sit and absorb records repeatedly, replaying sections, internalizing phrasing, letting it seep into his own playing without imitation. This habit, deep listening, shaped his originality more than any formal training ever could. It also hints at something Cross suggests throughout the biography. Hendrix wasn't trying to be loud for the sake of it. He was trying to translate what he heard inside his head into something the outside world could understand. When rehearsing with the experience, Hendrix wasn't authoritarian. He didn't issue commands or assert control through volume or ego. He rarely told anyone what to play outright. Instead, he demonstrated. If a part wasn't landing the way he felt it should, he'd simply pick up his guitar and play it the way he heard it in his head, letting the sound itself communicate the adjustment. There was no lecture, no confrontation. The expectation was embedded in the example. Cross describes Hendrix as someone who often avoided direct conflict, and you can see it here. He didn't dominate with personality. He led with sound. This approach shaped the atmosphere of rehearsals. Hendrix wasn't interested in efficiency for its own sake. He wasn't trying to run through songs as quickly as possible. Rehearsals often stretched long because he didn't stop when a song was technically correct. Good enough wasn't a stopping point. He was chasing a feeling, something intangible that couldn't be measured or written down. If it hadn't surfaced yet, they kept going. Sometimes that meant repeating the same passage again and again, not to tighten it, but to see if it would open up. That pursuit, chasing the feeling instead of the finish, shows up everywhere in Cross's portrait of him. Always searching, always adjusting, rarely satisfied. Not because he was impossible, but because he knew there was always something closer to what he heard in his head. Bandmates later recalled that these sessions could feel aimless on the surface, but they were anything but. Hendrix was listening for moments, small shifts in energy, unexpected tones, brief accidents that revealed something new. If a mistake produced an interesting sound, he didn't correct it. He followed it. Rehearsal wasn't about eliminating imperfections. It was about discovering possibilities. And as those possibilities expanded, so did the invisible pressure. The expectation that Hendrix would keep opening doors forever. As evening approached, Hendrix's energy shifted. He became more animated, more engaged, as if his internal signal sharpened with the fading light. Night suited him. The distractions of the day receded and focus settled in. Studios became second homes, places where time mattered less and sound mattered more. Once inside, he rarely watched the clock. Cross's biography emphasizes how fame didn't just give Hendrix opportunity, it gave him constant access, constant expectation, constant reasons not to stop. The night was where he could outrun the noise and chase the work. Some nights stretched until sunrise. Hendrix would move between amplifiers, guitars, and effects, testing limits, pushing equipment beyond what it was designed to handle. Feedback wasn't something to avoid. It was something to explore. He treated the studio like a laboratory, constantly adjusting settings, recording takes, listening back, then tearing it all apart to try something else. That's a key detail people miss. This wasn't only talent. It was relentless experimentation. It was hours. It was obsession. It was returning to the mirror again and again, until the reflection finally matched what he imagined. Engineers remembered how restless he was during these sessions. He didn't lock into one sound and protect it. He kept changing things. Knobs turned slightly, pedals swapped, amps repositioned, always searching, never settling. Perfection wasn't the objective. Finality wasn't interesting. What mattered was discovery, the moment when something unfamiliar emerged from the noise and revealed itself as meaningful. And when you live for discovery, stopping can feel like failure, even when your body is begging. And when that moment arrived, sleep became optional. The night extended. Fatigue receded. The process continued until the body could no longer keep pace with the mind. It was here, in these long, nocturnal stretches, that Hendrix was most himself, immersed, untethered, and slowly reinforcing a rhythm that would follow him long after the sun came up. Cross's framing makes this feel haunting in retrospect, not because the work wasn't worth it, but because the pace demanded a price that no one around him was truly positioned to pay on his behalf. Sleep, when it came, was inconsistent and rarely restorative. As Hendrix's fame accelerated, exhaustion became a constant background presence rather than an occasional problem. Touring schedules were relentless, structured around logistics rather than recovery. Flights, buses, sound checks, performances, interviews, all stitched together with little regard for rest. Days blurred into one another. Time zones lost meaning. Hotel rooms became interchangeable, each one briefly occupied, barely registered, then abandoned for the next. Cross highlights how rapidly Hendrix's life became a machine, and how little space there was for the human inside that machine. Some nights he slept only a few hours, collapsing just long enough to take the edge off fatigue before being pulled back into motion. Other times, his body shut down completely, forcing long stretches of sleep that felt less like rest and more like recovery from injury. Even then, it was temporary. The pace resumed as soon as he woke. His body paid the price for a mind that refused to slow down, accumulating fatigue in layers that never fully cleared. And when fatigue becomes your baseline, you stop recognizing it as a problem until it becomes unavoidable. Despite the chaos surrounding him, Hendrix was not careless in the way he's often portrayed. He was deeply sensitive, inward-looking, and acutely aware of the pressure bearing down on him. Fame didn't arrive gradually. It detonated. Almost overnight, he was expected not only to perform, but to redefine the instrument, to innovate endlessly, to justify the attention placed on him every time he stepped on stage. The weight of expectation followed him everywhere. Cross's biography digs into this. Hendrix wasn't just battling external demands. He was battling the internal pressure to live up to the myth forming around him in real time. With fame came the erosion of privacy. Daily life became crowded. Managers, promoters, journalists, fans, and hangers-on moved constantly through his orbit, each one needing something. Access to Hendrix became a commodity, and he often felt like the least protected person in the room. The quiet space he needed to function shrank rapidly, replaced by noise, obligation, and constant visibility. Cross describes a world where people didn't just want Hendrix. They wanted a piece of him, and they often didn't care what it cost him to keep giving it. When Hendrix did manage to find solitude, he guarded it carefully. He retreated into quiet rooms, turned inward, and reduced the world to manageable scale. He would write, play softly, think, sometimes doing very little at all. These moments weren't indulgences. They were essential maintenance. Without them, the pressure became overwhelming. Friends noticed that when this space disappeared, his mood shifted. He grew withdrawn, less present, visibly tired in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. Cross's framing makes solitude feel like the one place Hendrix could stop being reflected back at himself. The one place he could exist without an audience. Substances existed in his life, but not in the simplistic, reckless manner often attached to his legacy. They were part of the environment of the era and the industry, intertwined with exhaustion, stress, and relentless demand. What ultimately defined Hendrix's decline wasn't excess alone. It was depletion. Too little rest layered over too many expectations. Too much output with no space for recovery. A system that extracted endlessly without replenishing. That's the part that turns the story from sensational to tragic. The machine didn't slow down because it wasn't designed to. In the final months of his life, those closest to him noticed the cumulative toll. He was still creative, still driven, still searching. But the wear was visible now. Sleep deprivation magnified emotional strain. Small frustrations landed harder. The habits that had once fueled innovation now accelerated burnout. His daily rhythm, once flexible, adaptive, even freeing, had become unsustainable. Cross's biography leaves you with the sense that Hendrix was still trying to find a way out of the mirror room, still searching for some version of life where he could be a person again, not just a force of nature. The pattern hadn't changed. The cost had simply caught up. On September 18, 1970, that rhythm stopped. Hendrix died at 27 years old, leaving behind a body of work that reshaped music forever and a life that revealed the cost of relentless immersion. What makes Hendrix's daily habits so haunting isn't that they were extreme, it's that they were human. He followed curiosity, he chased feeling, he ignored the clock. And for a while, the world benefited enormously from that approach. But Cross's framing adds a darker layer. The myth didn't just grow around Hendrix, it grew into him, tightening the space he had left to breathe as himself. Jimi Hendrix didn't burn out because he lacked discipline. He burned out because his discipline was total. Every day fed the music. Every hour bent toward creation. There was no off switch, no safe distance, just a constant pull toward sound. And when you live that close to the work, you also live that close to the edge, because the edge is where discovery happens, but it's also where recovery disappears. And that's the quiet truth hiding behind the legend. Genius doesn't live in moments alone. It lives in patterns, in repetition, in habits that, over time, shape not just art, but the artist. If this deeper look into Jimi Hendrix's daily habits connected with you, consider liking the video and subscribing. And if there's another artist whose private life you want explored, leave it in the comments. There's always another story hiding between the notes. Thanks for watching.